Well, thank you, everybody. It's good to be down here. I actually grew up in Northern California. I'm going to get down here a little closer to you so I don't have to be so close to the slugs. I didn't lose anything. Good. Yeah, this is an interesting topic, and certainly it has been increasing in terms of visibility for a lot of folks, particularly those of us who work with ornamentals, but as you can see, it hits a lot of other crops as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and start. I'm a little hard of hearing, but if you do have questions, go ahead and belt them out. One way or another, I'll figure out what you're saying. But slugs and snails are definitely on the increase for us. The exotics are moving in. This is a pretty good representation of one of the ways that they can move in. Back in 1960, John Birch wrote that there were 725 species of land snails and 40 slug species, and 44 of the snails and 11 of the slugs were introduced. That was way back in 1960. By 2005, there were more than 80 alien or exotic gastropod species. And when I mentioned gastropod, that's just what a scientific term for the slugs and snails. This is actually in the, we talk about mollusks, and that's generally a grouping, a taxonomy that includes the slugs and snails. But a lot of times people don't know what we're talking about when we mention mollusks, or they worry about an exotic octopi, getting into their nurseries, and that obviously isn't happening. But what we do find is that slugs and snails is a useful term, and we'll keep to that for most of what we're going to talk about today. So the number keeps increasing. I know we have more than what was already up there. So if you're a regulator, and there are still a fair number of them left, one of the things that they're going to try to do is figure out how these things are moving in. The best way they've found a lot of times is looking at interception data. Now that's a little bit of a bias in that it is just what they're receiving. So there may be ways that things are moving in that we don't know about. But if you're trying to be efficient with limited dollars, post-sequestration, this is even going to be tougher. They're going to have very little money. So they're going to target what they consider high-risk activities or ways things are moving in. So there's some interesting work out there looking at interception data from a variety of countries, and I just wanted to show you briefly a little bit of that data. Cowie and Robinson, who are two incredibly talented malacologists, which is what we call folks who study slugs and snails, looked at these pathways that these exotics came in. And what they found was really interesting. So they, in the US, looking at 4,900 interceptions from 1993 through 1998, the number one way that they were coming in was on horticultural products. That's plants for planting, cut flowers, seeds, that sort of thing. 29%. Interestingly, the next most popular way they were coming in was tile. Now that's not the most intuitive thing for most of us, that every kitchen or bathroom remodel is a risk for exotic snails coming into the US. But it is really interesting when you think about it. Some of the snails they're most concerned about come from similar climates. So we're in a Mediterranean climate here on the West Coast. So they're concerned about snails from the Mediterranean area that can establish here and do very well. And so tile is imported in huge amounts from that same area. And if you think about a nice hot day and cool tile, it's a great place to hang out, probably a lot of weeds and things around those big piles of tile. And more importantly, what is tile made of in most cases? It has a major ingredient, calcium carbonate. And that's the exact same ingredient, chemical, that we need to have snails need to have to build shells. So it makes sense once you know about it, but it certainly isn't intuitive. Next up, commercial shipments. Again, This is a big pathway for things coming in, not just snails, but those big containers in the shipyards. I know you got, this is one of the busiest areas for bringing shipping in throughout the world. So you're in Seattle up near us is one of the other really, really major port areas. We have a port in Portland as well, but the volume is so much bigger in some of these other sites. So they adhere to the shipping containers or sometimes inside. Agricultural products came up next. This again could be lettuce or other produce that might have some of the snails in there as well. The aquarium industry, these come in often on plants. You'll find some of the aquatic snails coming in with those, and sometimes purposely introduced as well to reduce the algae and that sort of thing inside of some of the aquariums. Baggage, people do bring in snails, smuggle them in for various and sundry reasons, sometimes to eat, sometimes as pets, and sometimes for medicinal or spiritual reasons. And that's actually quite problematic, particularly with something like the giant African snail that came into Florida. And military shipments, wherever the military goes, there is a chance that with all the equipment and things, things could come back. And again, that's another risk for this particular area. Looking at Canada with 62 interceptions, right there, that's kind of interesting. We had 4,900 versus 62. That probably shows that somebody's looking a little bit more down here. But very similar story. Again, the number one of the 6250 came from horticultural products. Second most common, agricultural products. Third, those big shipping containers. And then, again, smuggled in baggage. If you looked at New Zealand with 22 interceptions, similar story, horticultural products. Number two, agricultural products. Commercial shipment containers. So you can see that story is very similar. It's why there is so much scrutiny of the horticultural and agricultural communities, particularly when there's interstate or international types of shipping, because this is what they found, is that this is a major pathway. So if you're a regulator, what do you worry about? What are the types of things that make a snail an invasive versus maybe innocuous, something that doesn't cause a problem? Well, they looked at certain traits, both in the basic biology of the snails, but as well with how the humans interact in this process as well. And included in that is looking at the range. As I mentioned, the Mediterranean area, those snails there, if they get over here, they're very well adapted. Have those snails increased ranges in other areas? Phylogenetic relationships. If those snails are related to another really horrific pest snail, that gets them up in the scrutiny. The adult size is almost, again, counterintuitive. The smaller the snail is, the more worried they are, because that is going to be hard to detect. It's going to sneak in or sneak around on our plant materials or other ways that we move them. Eggs and juvenile size, again, are they robust-sized eggs? Will they do well? Reproductive potential, well, that makes a lot of sense. You know, if they can increase their numbers in large amounts, that's very troublesome. Something like giant African snail, again, during its lifetime, you're looking at something like 1,600 eggs out there from one snail. So the chances for increase are pretty dramatic. Semoparous versus Idiroparous. These are great Scrabble words, but what do they mean? It's basically just saying, you know, do these things lay all their eggs during one season, or do they do it continuously over a number of years? Giant African snail, for instance, will live several years. It can keep laying eggs throughout those years. Some of the smaller snails, like the amber snail I'll talk about later on today, that sort of just does it all in one season. It really wants to get those eggs out there, and that can be very difficult, that the numbers of those eggs tend to be very large, and they sort of are just gambling everything at one time, and it makes it much, much harder to detect it in a timely manner. Selfing or outcrossing is another difficult term sometimes, but it's basically, for those of you, I know I've already had the buildup on this, but when you talk about slug sex or snail sex, we're dealing with hermaphrodites. And there is the ability for some of them to self-fertilize. It's pretty rare, not many species do it, but it can happen. And so that can be very worrisome that one snail could potentially create a population down the road. In terms of the human factor, introduction pressure, again, which ones are coming up time and time again? Theba pisana, which has established in this area of Southern California. It's really the only place in the US right now where it is established. Comes up time and time again in interception, so it's very high risk for lots of areas in the US. Invasion history, again, did these snails prove to be very successful at invading and moving and spreading wherever they got established? They look again at places like Hawaii or Australia. Did they do well there? That moves them up. Is it a major pest? Again, you can move around, but if you're not causing trouble, people don't tend to notice you. But if they're going to ravage the crops out there, cause a lot of damage, so that it gets up there. A multi-pest. When I mention that, again, Jim alluded to it a little bit, is that some of these are pests in different ways. So we can look at them as directly damaging. They could just end up being a contaminant pest that move around quite a bit, but don't cause direct damage as much. They could be both. On top of that, they may actually be a vector of diseases, plant diseases. They can move around quite a few spores of plant diseases, but human or other animal diseases as well. The giant African snail, for instance, is very, very concerning because it can move around a potentially lethal, although it's generally just a very serious, debilitating disease called rat lungworm. That disease has established in certain areas with that snail and can move into other slug and snail species that might actually be better carriers of the disease. That's the case in Hawaii, and as of October, they actually detected rat lungworm in Florida as well, with that population of giant African snail that they're fighting there. They can also be very serious vectors for some of the animals. They can get into some of the liver flukes and tapeworms and that sort of thing for folks who have cattle or waterfowl is exposed to these things. So it's, again, a big concern with the natural environment and the animals that inhabit it. And the economic potential, again, how devastating potentially is this snail or slug? So the importance of slime. I call this slime time for a reason, and part of it is that snails and slugs, they're really repellent to many people. It's not a part of everyday conversation. Most people are just completely reviled by them. Part of it is, the whole thing, the whole slime thing. It really does bother people. I found actually it's interesting that people seem to be more repelled by slugs than they are by snails. I think part of that is that you have a handle with snails. You can actually pick them up and move them. A slug, you just have to buy into the concept that you're going to touch the slime unless you have gloves on. Slime is a pejorative term in general. What's another term you could use for it? Well, mucus. That's not all that more pleasant when you think about it. So I try to think of a term that makes it a little bit more understandable for the particular uses it might be. And so I often mention another term for this stuff is lubrication. Lubrication has maybe a little bit more of a positive connotation to it, but it really does help these things in a lot of different ways. So when we look at slime, it allows snails and slugs to actually adhere to surfaces, which is kind of interesting because I just talked about it as a lubrication, but it actually does as well, by the way the molecules are formed, help them as they put pressure on the surface to actually adhere to walls and trees and other things, so that you actually can find these things climbing up and adhering to things. Here's an example. You saw the citrus tree. Here's another shot. This is out of Texas, where you see just tons of snails up in the trees. And a lot of people don't think of snails up in trees, but it's actually not uncommon. Dispersal, again, as it's a lubrication, it gives them incredible abilities to move over all kinds of surfaces. I don't have it in here, but I have images that are taken of these things climbing over straight edge razors. They have a volume of slime that basically takes care of that edge. It smooths the transition over those surfaces. So when you hear of people talking about eggshells, diatomaceous earth, and some of these other rough surfaces, other than kind of gumming them up for a short term, it really isn't going to stop them. And a lot of those don't take moisture very well, which is something that is very important when you're dealing with slugs and snails, because without moisture, you don't have activity. So it's not a great combination for us to use tools that don't work with moisture. They produce it out of the slime out of several areas of the body. One is a petal gland, and sometimes you'll actually see this kind of interesting pattern where you see these little skips, and that's just because they're not producing it over the entire length of their body sometimes. This is almost a perfect figure 8. The U.S. judge was going to give it a 5.6 just because they really did a good job on that. They also disperse sometimes when they're in the trees. They can just hang down from what's called a slime cord. And they can just kind of drop if needed, if there's a challenge to them, something that they need to get away from. They use it for defense. It deters a lot of predators. I've seen some interesting images of snakes trying to eat these things, and they're so fouled up with the mucus from the snail or slug that they can't actually grasp them, and they get away. It also helps them kind of move their bodies in ways you wouldn't ordinarily suspect. This is a defensive posture from the European red slug. That slug was literally 4 inches long, but it managed to retract into this little tiny round hump. And it's very hard for an animal to grasp that round hump. It just makes it hard to get a biting edge on it. And water retention, as I mentioned, this is lubrication. It really is hydrophilic. It attracts moisture. That's really important for these things, particularly for something like a slug that can dry out and die. They really need all the moisture they can get from the environment. They literally have one layer of what we call epithelial or skin cells, and they can basically absorb water from the environment. So if the relative humidity is high, they can absorb that moisture from that environment. And it helps them get into spaces that you wouldn't really suspect. One Easter, my son came up and said, "Mom, the Easter bunny gave me a slug." It was a little hard to explain why the Easter bunny would do that. I finally said that maybe that one was for me because, Mom likes slugs. But that's the hole. It's a little teeny tiny hole there. These things can go into very tight spaces. And if need be, they can actually eat the slime. Sometimes you'll see some of these things with what's called a slime plug at the very end of them, and when they get hungry, they can eat that. And it's used in the mating process. And I'll show a little bit more on reproduction down the road. So these things eat a lot of different things. That's one of the problems with the snails and slugs, is that many of the species are omnivorous and they can survive on a lot of things. Some are much more host specific and eat one type of food. But you can see that there's algae, feces, carrion, centipedes, fungi. They'll eat other slugs. Lots of things that they eat. Now these are the teeth they have. They have a kind of tongue-like mouth that has a bunch of little individual teeth that can break off. It's kind of like shark teeth, but they can reproduce those teeth. And that's called a radula. And when they feed, they scrape like a rasp on the material that they're eating. Now here's one slug eating another dead slug. There's another shot of similar sorts of things. So it's really not uncommon to see them eating each other. Some of the native snails and slugs, for instance, are very well adapted to the forest environment and will break down mushrooms. These are the ultimate decomposers. You want them to decompose. There's stuff we don't want around, but they're very well adapted. This is a Pacific sideband that we have up in the north, and really not a problem in gardens or anywhere, just beautiful snail. I once got a sample of brown garden snail into my office, and I was gone for a couple of weeks, and they brought in a container, but they didn't have a lid, so they put a magazine on top of it. Some of the nursery people might recognize the buckeye. I came back, I was kind of interested because I had noticed they had started chewing on the magazine, so being a scientist, I was curious enough to just leave it and see what they did. And by gosh, those snails just kept eating and eating. And they went through 46 pages of the buckeye, which I jokingly say I rarely do. And a kind of classic example of what goes in comes out. It looks a lot like the buckeye on the other side. But eventually they didn't get enough moisture, and they closed themselves off, and eventually I let them die. So damage, as I said, you have a rasping mouth part, so you tend to see sort of skeletonization eventually to entire holes. There's a very small brown garden snail. Over time, they can do quite a bit of damage, as most of you probably know. Slugs, very similar sort of thing, basically. Here's a red hot poker where they were more attracted to the flower than they were to the foliage. And sometimes it's kind of subtle. This is Scotch Moss. We grow a lot of it up there in the industry, and it took me until I actually saw it feeding to realize what that damage in that Scotch Moss was. And I could help my growers who were trying to figure out what was going wrong. They thought it was fertilizer, spray damage. We finally figured out it's the slugs feeding on the Scotch Moss. So I mentioned reproduction. They are both male and female. Occasionally they can self-fertilize, but most of the time they don't, which is better to have a mix of genes out there. They exchange sperm packets, and then they produce eggs, usually anything, you're usually looking about 2 to 3 weeks after mating for the average snail or slug. And from an IPM standpoint, what we try to do is break the life cycle by preventing this from occurring. Try to get them before they mate and lay eggs. So I want to reinforce that as much as possible. Try not to let that cycle continue. So timing is really, really critical with these guys. So I sometimes show this, and I know Jim would be disappointed if I didn't show this. One day my husband ran into the house and said, Robin, this is the biggest slug I've ever seen on the side of the house. And he doesn't usually get excited about slugs. You know, he's pretty even-tempered with these sort of things, puts up with my thing. And so I went out and I went, that's not one slug, that's two. And I was really excited because I realized this was Limas Maximus, the giant spotted leopard slug. And this one is renowned for its courtship. I'd only seen line drawings of it at the time, so I ran in, grabbed my camera. My son came out. We all watched the courtship of Limas Maximus. And this is two of the slugs together. They're everting their reproductive structures, as I say in my G-rated terms. And they basically are hanging from a slime cord. They wrap themselves around each other, then they wrap their reproductive structures together, and then they exchange the sperm at the end. In a few weeks, you'll have some eggs laid out in the environment. Those are actually brown garden snail eggs in that case. You know, the courtships are pretty interesting and elaborate in some cases, but again, the important thing is to try to get a feel for when that is happening. You can almost always see it by direct observation if you're out there in the right timing. Important to know there are a lot of different species. This again is that Limas Maximus. Really big eggs on those. But not all species mate and lay eggs at the same time. It's going to be really tied down here probably to spring rain, or not spring rain, the rainy season. But you've got to remember you are creating a rainy season if you have irrigation. So you might mess up what would be the natural reproductive timing and cycle. Photoperiod might work with that, and temperature a little bit, but these are things to think of. These guys know when the situation is right for them to have good survival of their eggs. So again, just more of that kind of mating stuff. They do all sorts of interesting things. They have love darts and great stuff. Steamy sexual scenes, but most people don't appreciate it. When we worry about these things, there are certain things that we're concerned about, and one of them is estivation. And that's the ability that snails have to create a little door, basically. When the situation isn't great for them, too dry, too hot in the summer, they'll climb up and adhere to a surface and then secrete a little calcium-based type of doorway, what we call it an epiphragm. If it's really, really dry, they may have several of those. Sometimes they just do a light one, and if it gets rains, then they'll break out of that estivation immediately and move around. Sometimes they're a little bit deeper into that estivation. Slugs, for instance, only 5% of slugs are above ground in summer. They can't do that same thing that the snails can do, so they go deep. So if you're dealing with slugs, you have to think that way. They're in the soil. They're very deep sometimes. The other thing about being in the soil is they will go after seeds and roots, and most people don't know how much damage is going on the seeds and roots from these things. It can be pretty spectacular, the amount of damage that happens. Sometimes they wait for the seeds to germinate before they feed, depending on species. Slugs and snails, as I mentioned, can be arboreal. I think I have a picture of that estivation here, again, on the side of the house. That's not uncommon with brown garden snail. Here's the slugs. Most people don't think of slugs even up in the trees and things, but just like snails, they will climb. They just won't stay there for long. That's mostly at night or on a very low light day. As I mentioned, they are aware of light and shadows. They have very primitive eyes, but they can see that. They can sense humidity and move toward moisture. Again, if you're a slug, that totally makes sense. They can home in on scents. I've read that they can smell, basically, from about 3 feet away. So they often in the slime trails, they have smells in those chemical smells that they follow in those slime trails. So they can move toward a source of food, they can smell it, they can follow those slime trails, they can find other slugs to mate with or to eat by following those trails. Now, I mentioned before these are mollusks, they're gastropods. The land snails are generally what we're concerned about in this room, although there are a lot of aquatic snails. So you'll hear those called pulmonatas. Basically, it's just talking about the lungs in there. So gastropod just means stomach and foot, and it's this great name for these things because they are just a stomach on a foot, moving around. They eat for a living. And then they're pulmonate, so that just gives you a good feel for that. And the other thing that Stylomatophora is, I got to get here. So that means stalk eye, which is perfect because they have eyes on the tentacles here. Some people call them antenna, and that's not the accurate term. These are tentacles. They have an optic tentacle with a little eye at the top, and then they have a sensory tentacle down here that really does most of the tasting and the smelling. Identification. Well, you know, up in my area, I don't know if you're old enough to know Tiny Tim, who tiptoed through the tulips. I tiptoe through the slugs. I have such incredible pressure up there, I literally do have to avoid stepping on them. And this was my one delphinium flower that I grew one year that I got past most of the damage. I had the beautiful stalk up there, and then I came back the next day, and there were literally 14 slugs that had pulled over that stalk just by the weight of the slugs. And within this, there are 4 species of slugs. And I thought, well, you know, at the time, I knew you could tell them that there were different slugs, but I didn't know how do you tell a species of slug? You know, I know flowers, how do you tell those apart? Insects. But there is a little bit to it. You can tell these things apart. There are keys, and I'm going to let Rory talk about his excellent key that he developed. But one of the things to keep in mind is you're going to need to tell these things apart, you're going to need to learn some features like the pneumostome here, which is basically their breathing area. I call it the blowhole sometimes. They have their genital structures up here near the head, a little different, but works for them. And then the foot, the keel here on this particular species, it's not here very much, but there's some species is very pronounced. And the mantle, if this was a snail per se, this would secrete the shell. Mostly the shell is being secreted underneath there. Snails, we do use the shell usually for ID. It's usually not this easy. It's not this easy. So again, you're looking at pictorial keys and that sort of thing. It helps to know a little bit about what the parts are, so you can get quite a bit of answers from that. Now I'm talking about snails and slugs as if they're really different, and they're really not. The slugs have basically evolved over time to reduce the shell. And how do we know that? Well, we get to see a lot of intermediaries. This is Testicella, another exotic slug moving around, and it's got just a tiny remnant of the snail shell still left. This one's around in our area, and I believe down this way as well. Here's a more dramatic example. We call these semi-slugs when they have a little of both of the characters there. So again, you're going to need to know the parts to ID these things. Why would you even care about the species knowing that? Well, again, these are not all the same. They mate at different times. They have different habits. Some like cool weather, some like hot weather. It really, really helps to know the species you're working with. So I encourage you, if you don't know what you have, to try to get it into people who can help you with these IDs. And again, lots of good resources now from pictures that can help with some of these. Dispersal, this is everything. Trying to know something about how they move. Again, they can move on equipment. They can move on trucks or automobiles. So those are the sort of things you've got to look at in nursery sites or landscapes. Are you actually moving things around? They move slowly, I admit, but things add up over time. Banana slugs have moved 6.5 inches per minute. Well, that's, 2 minutes, you've got a foot, literally. So, you can see some pretty good progress out there. 40 feet in a single night from the milky slug. That's the most common slug around, common pest slug. They've done very good scientific work with mark and release, and 124 feet from the original release site after 6 months. They're moving around. They don't always go in a straight line by any means. If anything, they tend to kind of go in circles around their food. And most on-site damage is by local populations. These things are very territorial, so they will hang out in the same area, but they will migrate in from the edges, as you've already heard. There's a little bit of a blame game there. They will go back and forth, so you guys can blame each other quite a bit. Wherever the food's best, they will go. So when you think about that thing, what is around the sites you're working with? Do you need to start thinking barriers, fences, that sort of thing? How can I keep them from moving into an area I've already treated? So I'm just going to go very briefly on management. There's more management that we'll be talking about today, but I just want to give you a little bit of a feel for some of the things that we look at. This varies by state in a huge way. I'm from Oregon. I know what we have up there. Different states require different things. Where you're shipping is really incredible. So you've got to know if you're a nursery or produce or whatever, what the restrictions are at the state or site you're sending to. But I do want to mention there's a lot of biocontrol. Again, Rory's going to talk a bit about that, but there's small mammals, hedgehogs, shrews. Not a lot of hedgehogs out this way, but in other areas there are some groundhogs. Birds, snakes, as I mentioned, spiders. There are other snails and slugs. This is the rosy wolf snail. This has been moved around as a biocontrol agent with, unfortunately, pretty horrific problems for some of the native snails where it's been moved to. Can be a similar story a little bit with some of these predatory snails. So I'll let Rory talk a little bit about some of those. But we have crabbed beetles that eat snails. Even firefly larvae, which we don't have as many out here. We don't have any that light up here, but we do have some species. But out east, obviously, they have quite a few more out that way. Even in Hawaii, they actually have a predatory caterpillar, which I thought was really interesting. And it actually sort of webs the opening of the shell and then goes in and eats the snail, which makes everybody feel a little better, I guess. So cultural control, we talk about a number of things. Actually, let me go back just briefly. Cultivation, I want to mention this because it's ironic. As we move toward conservation techniques like no-till, the slug populations in particular have really, really increased. Tillage cultivation is huge for reducing populations of slugs in particular, snails as well. But slugs go into the soil, as I mentioned. They lay their eggs there. Any disturbance, anything that gets those eggs up or slugs up to dry out or be more available to predators is helpful. So it's a balance, but they're really struggling with no-till and slugs right now. Sanitation. I'll talk about it more with the amber snails, but a lot of these snails prefer decaying, dying types of plant material. So you need to pay attention to that out there. If you can clean that stuff up, you really reduce the habitat for these things. Trap crops. Some people believe in this. I'm a little nervous about it because I think it kind of increases habitat. But there are folks who believe that if you have somewhere else for them to go, that they prefer, that they won't go to what you really are concerned about. It's a fine art, but some people do work with it. Barriers, I showed a little bit of that copper stripping, and I hadn't realized that those were getting pulled off by animals, so it's going to make me think about how to adhere these things for those who work with them. I have found with the slugs, it really has to be quite wide. They really will cross over a very narrow strip, particularly the larger slugs. And we have 4, 5, 6-inch slugs up our way. They aren't repelled at all. The little tiny ones do seem to be a little more repelled. Here's some of that banding again. Hand picking in some situations, large critters, this works. Amber snails, good luck. They're so tiny, there's no way. But you know, a lot to be said for hand picking if your site is amenable to it. Traps help with monitoring. It won't pick up enough of the population, but it does, I think, help with a lot of the monitoring. And then I also want to mention, in particular, irrigation. Again, these things really need moisture. Snails not as much as the slugs, but it's still key for them for activity. So if you can keep irrigation where you want it, like drip irrigation, micro sprinkler heads, really keeping things tight, you can do a lot to reduce the pressure. And then when you irrigate. Now I know that's difficult when you have a lot of acreage or a lot of sites, but this can also help if you're instructing homeowners. There's been really nice work in cabbage, looking in this case at a slug, where they compared evening versus morning waterings and also with baits. And so an evening watering with no baits, they lost 40 to 60% of the leaf area. Evening watering plus baits resulted only in 6 to 12% leaf loss, but morning watering with no bait resulted in 6 to 12% leaf loss. So here was a cultural technique that gave them essentially the same level of damage control as with baits. That really tells you how important that whole moisture tie-in is with these snails and slugs. So again, I'm going to start talking a little bit about the chemicals in the time I have left, and hopefully Jim will keep me honest here and won't let me run over too long. But again, it varies per state and what your situation is, so just remember, read the label, be legal out there so we can keep all these things around if we need them. I also want to just kind of bring up some things for you to think about too. You don't always have to kill things. Sometimes you just need to drive them away, especially with the contaminant pest issues. If you're shipping and you don't want something on your plant, you don't have to kill it, you just have to have it gone. In some cases. This won't work if you have snail certification and all that kind of things, but if, in our case, sometimes it's just got to be out of the shipment. So there's more and more work in the future looking at alternative chemistries. We're trying to have some options that aren't just carbamates. We have a few coming in already, but I think you're going to see a lot more of this work in the future. And so repellents can be useful if we can keep plants off, and they've been looking at geraniums, oils derived from caraway, copper, you've already kind of heard a little bit, but copper's definitely in there, garlic extract, and urea formaldehyde fertilizers as well have been used. We've looked a tiny bit, nothing in enough replication, but there has been some replicated work with Texar mats, which are the weed mats that have copper impregnated into them, mostly for weed and algae type of control. But in Europe, they looked and they had a 98% reduction in snail activity, 90% of the slugs died, 93% less slugs, and 90% less slug eggs. The damage on the leaves was less as well. And then they had 38% fewer snails on the Texar, but they also had some growth of moss on those. So we're thinking that might be a useful type of incorporation into some of our nursery systems, retail nurseries in particular, where spraying is very difficult. I've heard good word of mouth, but we need more replicated trial work with this stuff. And 2.3% solution of insecticidal soap has also been used basically to just kind of remove slush off the snails off of plant material before shipping. That was work by Mike Perella up at UC Davis way back. Anti-feedants are another area that people are looking at. Again, if you're more concerned about direct damage from slugs and snails, this is some of the ways that people are looking. They're looking at different substances coming out of, in this case, a mushroom. Limonene, we worked with this, I'll talk about this, but this is basically distilled citrus peels. It smells like orange, it's like somebody's eating an orange next to you. It's great. Saponins look really, really promising. Those come from Chenopodium type of plants. Again, spinach, other plants, and umbilifers, neem, and artemisia. So you can see a lot of botanicals being looked at. And there's been a little bit of work with caffeine, particularly Hollingsworth in Hawaii looked at this. You'll see this come up quite a bit. It does have activity, but the amount of caffeine that is needed is quite high, and ecologically it concerns the EPA, so I don't think we'll ever get a registration with that. And then some other plants, again, out of desert type environments where it looks like they have some other products. These are the kind of the current types of things that we're seeing most used, you know, the metaldehyde, methiacarb, and the iron phosphate increasingly in many sites. Many of you are probably familiar with these. There are ways to use these things that work better. You know, you can kind of refine your technique. Metaldehyde, particularly the timing, if you come off a wet, warm, rainy period, moving into a hot, dry, sunny period, that's perfect timing, because those slugs and snails will be feeding. They'll feed on this stuff, they'll foam up and desiccate pretty quickly. If it's cool or wet and rainy, a lot of times those slugs and snails can recover. They can absorb again that moisture from the environment and recover. And sometimes there will be bait aversion. They won't eat that bait again because they know it had a bad effect. That's been documented. Methiocarb, mesurol, pretty hot, category 1. Very difficult when you want to ship and you've got to wait for this reentry. But it does tend to work better in the cooler, wetter season, so it's a key tool for many of the growers still. Iron phosphate, again, you can find out a little bit more about that here as well. But I think we're seeing quite a few people looking at this and working with this. It does work very well, and again, not as limited by temperatures. The difference is in evaluation, I think. For many people, they don't see dead foaming slugs and snails out there, and they don't think it works. But the thing with the iron phosphate is it stops the feeding almost immediately, and they basically will know that they're sick, like a lot of animals will crawl away and hide so that they're not, you know, food for predators. So you won't see the bodies as much, but what you will see is the cessation of feeding. The damage will stop, and that's kind of the point in many cases, is that we just don't want them feeding. So you look for less feeding damage when you're evaluating those treatments. And again, I mentioned there's some other things kind of coming on where we have nursery labels already. Orange Guard, this is that limonene. Sinecure, cinnamaldehyde. And it's difficult to find this product, but I know that we do have more cinnamon-based products out there. Malathion and carbaryl are both carbamates. They don't have slugs and snails on the label. Some states you can use these because they have a site label. Maybe you've got caterpillars out there as well. But just know that you will have an effect from using those on snails and slugs. I have more information at my website. I've been trying to slowly build this section. It's the Pacific Northwest Nursery IPM. And I've just tried to make it kind of a slug and snail clearinghouse. So I put links to keys or new information. If you want to learn about giant African snail or the rat lungworm, I try to have that kind of information there. I even have a really cool little movie called Moss Grove, where a local filmmaker used time lapse with slugs, and until you see racing slugs, you just haven't lived. It's really cool. But anyway, that's the place to go. I try to get as many results and things like that up there. It's not everything we know by any means, but it's slowly gaining traction. About 30% of my hits are from snail and slug-related types of activities. And that's pretty much the end of this particular talk. I'll be talking in a little while. And I don't know if I have time for any questions, or I can take those when I come back.
Brian, could you get the lights for me? All right. Thank you, Rob.
I've got a few. Thank you. And I have a few.
Yes, this is a chance, so please ask Robin a couple of questions. We have time.
I see.
Cultivating, how deep does that have to be?
Oops.
Affect the slugs.
Sorry, I just destroyed the. I'm sorry. One more time with the.
Cultivating the soil, how deep does that have to be to affect the
It really does. The question is cultivating for slugs and how deep do you have to go? It kind of depends a little on the slug, but I think if you're, I don't convert very well. I think I've heard if you can get 3 to 5 centimeters, so that's probably, it's not that. It really doesn't have to be that deep. They don't want to dig any more than they want to. So if the soil's really dry, they're going to go deeper. So you'd have to go deeper. If it's pretty wet, if you're at field capacity, they won't have to go so deep. Slugs and snails also prefer different types of soil. So for if you have heavier soil, clay soil with more cracks, bigger clods, ideal for slugs and snails because they can get down easier. Fine, it's much harder, although they like laying their eggs in the finer soil. So little bits of information, you sometimes wonder how you can actually use it, but sometimes it helps explain what you're seeing in different sites that should be the same, but the soil is different. But yeah, it is a great technique. We do, it's hard if if you're a container grower, it's not an option. But if you're growing in the field, if you can cultivate, especially during that drier time when they're in the soil, it's a great technique. In Australia, they actually, with snails, they actually, because they're on the surface more, they tend to come in with these big rollers, and they roll over the snails and try to break the shells a lot. So that's another technique you can do a little bit more in the field. I know Buzz has one, and there's something over this way.
Just curious, up in your region, have you seen any reduced activity with Metaldehyde, and what's your take on potential resistance to Metaldehyde?
Yeah, I remember you were asking that when you were up. We had a slug and snail meeting a few years ago back in Portland, and I don't know, because I know there's techniques for using it, and people don't always know how to use the product really well. I don't think, I was talking to Rory about this, I don't know if anybody's actually done the work. It shouldn't be that complicated by somebody who's looked at resistance to be able to determine it, but I can't really speak to it scientifically without that kind of backing. I suspect, given how limited our tools are in the pressure, it would make sense that we might develop resistance. That's why we're trying to incorporate so many of these other new tools into these things, because I want to protect the few tools we have, and carbamates may or may not last for us because they're nerve poisons, but I would like to see people at least alternating so that they can rotate out. And the problem is that slugs and snails, that population, if you had a resistant, it's probably not going to have a lot of different genes in there. It's probably going to be a stable resistance. But yeah, I would like to see that work done too, because I don't know. It'd be good.
I don't know if I really see, in some of the studies I've done, seen actual resistance, because a lot of times I'll get my test animals from an organic grove, so they've never been exposed. But here again, the efficacy is just not what iron phosphate now is. So I don't know. The nurseries, obviously, where they're continuously applying Metaldehyde base. I can see
And even there, the different bait formulations can make a difference. I know with the younger juveniles, it's often better to use the liquid formulations because they don't actually like those big bait chunks. So the older snails and slugs will go for the bigger pelleted size, but the liquids actually work better sometimes with the juveniles. But yeah, it's very difficult, and I think we'd just be guessing right now until somebody actually jumps on and does that work. And question here? I know I've got another one there, sorry. You were, thank you.
With the liquid metaldehyde, that seems to be a rather water-soluble product. If we spray it on, and in an irrigation process, it's going to be moved. Have you seen any issues or anything? Can we put a sticker to make it stay longer? Will it be still effective?
With metaldehyde moving into...
With the liquid.
Oh, with the liquid? Actually, it tends to be fairly rain fast, more than you would think. Again, when working with metaldehyde, I suggest people, as much as possible, try to wait till they have a drier surface, because about within 24 hours, you lose about 50% of the activity. It breaks down pretty quickly when it's moist. So if you can wait for that dry period, which is tough, it's better here than where we are, believe me. But it makes all the difference, and that's going to be your best timing too, because you want to move into a dry cycle so the sun can bake those ill slugs. So I'm not as worried about that. Almost everything has risk benefit, and so yeah, I do think about that. But it does stay for a while, and it's actually active, I think, longer than some of the pellets. Not as much of a chance for mold that I see with some of the other baits. That's just been my experience with it. More anecdotal.
I think we'll go ahead and
Yeah, and I'll be around, and I talk again, so if you can hold your questions. And you were polite to let somebody go ahead, so we'll make sure you get...
Right, so she is speaking again, and she'll be here, so.
Great.